The rain hammered against the grimy windows of Murphy's bar like bullets from an angry sky. Inside the dimly lit establishment, Jake Murphy wiped down glasses with practiced efficiency while keeping one eye on the news broadcast flickering on the ancient television mounted above the bar. The reporter's voice crackled through static as she spoke about another failed diplomatic contact with the alien species that had appeared in Earth's outer solar system 6 months ago. Jake had seen enough alien footage to last him a lifetime. The various species looked like nightmares pulled from humanity's oldest fears: insectoids, with clicking mandibles, gelatinous beings that shifted and pulsed, and worst of all, the dragons. Massive, scaled creatures with wings that could blot out the sun and eyes like molten gold. The news called them the most dangerous of all the alien visitors, citing their refusal to communicate and their tendency to destroy any ship that approached too closely. The bell above the door chimed, and Jake looked up from his glass-cleaning routine. What stepped through his door made his blood freeze in his veins. It was a dragon, not the massive, building-sized monsters from the news footage, but still unmistakably one of them. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, the creature had to duck slightly to clear the door frame. Dark green scales caught the light from the neon beer signs, creating an almost hypnotic pattern across its muscular form. Wings, currently folded tight against its back, rustled with each movement. Golden eyes swept the interior of the bar with an intelligence that made Jake's skin crawl. Every instinct screamed at Jake to run, to call the authorities, to do anything except what he found himself doing. Instead, he set down his glass and nodded toward the creature as if it were just another customer seeking shelter from the storm. "Evening," Jake said, his voice steadier than he had any right to expect. "Rough night to be out." The dragon's head tilted slightly, a gesture so human-like that it caught Jake off guard. Those golden eyes focused on him with laser intensity, and when the creature spoke, its voice was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "Indeed," the dragon said, the single word carrying an accent that Jake couldn't place. Not quite British, not quite something else entirely. "I seek respite from the storm." Jake nodded toward the row of empty stools at the bar. "Well, you've come to the right place. Though I have to say, you're the first of your kind to walk into my establishment." The dragon approached the bar with careful, measured steps. Its claws clicked against the wooden floor with each footfall. When it settled onto one of the reinforced bar stools, Jake silently thanked his grandfather for building everything in this place to last. The furniture groaned but held. "What can I get you?" Jake asked, falling back on the familiar routine of bartending. It was easier to focus on the job than on the fact that he was serving a creature that could probably tear him in half without breaking a sweat. The dragon's expression, insofar as Jake could read expressions on such an alien face, seemed puzzled. "I am unfamiliar with your customs. What would you recommend?" Jake studied his unexpected patron. There was something about the way the creature held itself, a bearing that spoke of authority and command. This wasn't some lost tourist or confused alien. This was someone important, someone used to being obeyed without question. "Depends on what you're looking for," Jake said, reaching for a clean glass. "Something to warm you up after being out in that mess? Something strong to forget your troubles? Or just something to pass the time?" The dragon considered this for a long moment. Its golden eyes never left Jake's face, as if searching for some hidden meaning in his words. "Warmth," the dragon finally said. "It has been a long time since I have felt truly warm." There was something in those words, a weariness that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Jake had heard that tone before, usually from customers carrying burdens too heavy for their shoulders. He reached for a bottle he kept on the top shelf, a whiskey that had been aging since before the aliens arrived. "Irish whiskey," Jake said as he poured 2 fingers into a glass. "Aged 25 years. Smooth enough not to burn, but with enough fire to warm you from the inside out." He slid the glass across the bar, noting how the dragon's claws clicked against the glass as it picked it up. The creature sniffed delicately at the amber liquid, then took a tentative sip. The reaction was immediate and surprising. The dragon's eyes widened, and what Jake could only interpret as a smile crossed its reptilian features. "This is..." The dragon paused, searching for words. "Exquisite. I had not expected such craftsmanship from your species." "Yeah, Well, we're full of surprises, Jake said, pouring himself a smaller measure. He had a feeling this was going to be one of those nights where he needed a drink himself. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, the only sounds the rain against the windows and the distant hum of the television. Jake found himself studying his customer more closely, noting details he had missed in his initial shock. The dragon's scales weren't uniform in color, darker patches mixed with lighter ones in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. There were scars, too, old ones by the look of them, crisscrossing the visible portions of its arms and neck. This was a creature that had seen battle, and plenty of it. You know, Jake said, breaking the silence, in all the news reports, they say your people don't communicate with humans. Yet here you are, speaking English better than half my regular customers. The dragon's golden eyes fixed on him again, and Jake caught something that might have been amusement in their depths. Perhaps, the dragon said carefully, the news reports do not tell the complete story. They rarely do, Jake agreed. I'm Jake, by the way. Jake Murphy. This is my bar. The dragon hesitated, as if weighing whether to respond with its own name. Finally, it spoke. You may call me Zephyr. Jake nodded, filing away the fact that the name sounded chosen rather than given. Well, Zephyr, what brings you to my little corner of the world on a night like this? Zephyr took another sip of whiskey before answering. I find myself displaced, seeking perspective that I cannot gain among my own kind. There was a story there, Jake could tell. Years of bartending had given him a sixth sense for customers carrying emotional baggage. The trick was knowing when to probe and when to let them talk in their own time. Displacement's a hell of a thing, Jake said, refilling Zephyr's glass without being asked. Sometimes you need to step outside your normal world to see it clearly. Yes, Zephyr said, the single word heavy with meaning. Though stepping outside brings its own complications. The television droned on in the background. The reporter now discussing humanity's attempts to establish formal diplomatic relations with the various alien species. Jake noticed Zephyr's attention drift to the screen, those golden eyes narrowing slightly. They speak of diplomacy, Zephyr observed. Yet they know so little of what they propose. How so? Jake asked, genuinely curious. Zephyr was quiet for a long moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Your species assumes that all who come to your system seek the same things. Territory, resources, conquest. They cannot conceive that some might seek something far more valuable. Such as? Understanding, Zephyr said simply. Your species possesses something that mine has forgotten. Something we traded away long ago in our pursuit of power. Jake leaned against the bar, intrigued despite the surreal nature of the conversation. And what's that? Zephyr gestured around the bar with one clawed hand. This. The ability to show kindness to a stranger. To offer warmth without expectation of reward. In my culture, such gestures are seen as weakness. Sounds like a pretty cold way to live, Jake observed. It is, Zephyr agreed. Colder than the void between stars. The admission seemed to surprise the dragon as much as it did Jake. Zephyr stared down at his drink, lost in thought. Jake had the distinct impression that this was the first time the creature had ever voiced such thoughts aloud. The bell above the door chimed again, and Jake looked up to see his regular customer, Mrs. Chen, hurrying in from the storm. She was soaked to the bone and muttering complaints about the weather in 3 different languages. Then she saw Zephyr and stopped dead in her tracks. Jake tensed, ready to intervene if the situation went south. Mrs. Chen was 75 years old and had survived the Chinese civil wars, the economic collapse of '89, and 3 different alien invasion scares in the past year. She wasn't easily intimidated, but she also wasn't stupid. For a moment, the two stared at each other across the bar. Then Mrs. Chen shook her head and made her way to her usual stool, 3 seats down from the dragon. Evening, Mrs. Chen, Jake said, trying to project normalcy. The usual? The usual? Yes, she said, still eyeing Zephyr warily. And make it a double. This weather is trying to kill me. Jake poured her regular gin and tonic, noting how she kept stealing glances at Zephyr. The dragon, for his part, seemed more amused than concerned by the scrutiny. "You are not afraid," Zephyr observed, addressing Mrs. Chen directly. The old woman snorted. "At my age, what's the point? I've seen worse things than you." "Young man." "Young man?" Zephyr repeated, and Jake could have sworn he heard laughter in the dragon's voice. "You heard me, Mrs. Chen said firmly. "Scales or no scales, you've got that look about you. Like you think you know everything but haven't lived long enough to realize how much you don't know." Jake held his breath, waiting to see how Zephyr would react to being dressed down by a 75-year-old human woman. To his amazement, the dragon's reaction was to laugh a sound like distant thunder that somehow managed to be warm rather than threatening. "You speak with the wisdom of years," Zephyr said respectfully. "I confess, I am younger than my appearance might suggest." "Thought so," Mrs. Chen said with satisfaction. "Jake, pour our young friend another drink. Looks like he needs it." "On." Jake found himself grinning as he refilled Zephyr's glass. "Trust Mrs. Chen to treat an 8-foot-tall alien dragon like an overgrown teenager having a crisis of confidence." The three of them settled into an easy rhythm, with Mrs. Chen regaling them with stories of her youth in Hong Kong, and Zephyr listening with rapt attention. It occurred to Jake that this might be the first normal conversation the dragon had ever had with humans. No political posturing, no formal protocols, just three individuals sharing drinks and stories on a rainy night. As the evening wore on, Jake noticed subtle changes in Zephyr's demeanor. The stiff, formal bearing gradually relaxed, and the dragon began to speak more freely about his own experiences, though he was careful never to reveal too much about his origins or purpose on Earth. "In my culture," Zephyr said during a lull in Mrs. Chen's storytelling, "we are taught that strength comes from isolation, from the ability to stand alone against all challenges. Weakness is anything that makes one dependent on others." "Sounds lonely," Jake observed. "It is," Zephyr admitted. "But it is also familiar. I have known no other way." Mrs. Chen fixed the dragon with a sharp look. "Familiar doesn't mean right, young man. Sometimes the hardest thing is admitting that everything you've been taught is wrong." Zephyr's golden eyes studied the old woman with new respect. "You speak of experience. Revolution, war, exile, starting over in a new country with nothing but the clothes on my back," Mrs. Chen said matter-of-factly. "You learn quick that the people who help you when you have nothing to offer in return, those are the ones worth knowing." Jake topped off everyone's drinks, marveling at the surreal normalcy of the scene. An alien dragon emperor, for he was becoming more convinced that's what Zephyr truly was, getting life advice from a retired seamstress while taking shelter in a rundown bar in Queens. It was the kind of story no one would believe if he told it. The storm outside began to abate, the hammering rain gradually subsiding to a gentle patter against the windows. Jake noticed Zephyr glance toward the door several times, and realized his unusual patron was preparing to leave. "I should go," Zephyr said finally, finishing the last of his whiskey. "The storm has passed." "More's the pity," Mrs. Chen said. "Was just getting to know you." Zephyr stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding from the bar stool. "This evening has been illuminating. I find myself reluctant to end it." "Then don't," Jake said impulsively. "Doors open whenever you need a drink and some company. No questions asked. On way." Jake said in dull. Something shifted in Zephyr's expression, surprise, gratitude, and something else Jake couldn't quite identify. "You would welcome me back? Even knowing what I am?" "I know what you are," Jake said firmly. "You're a customer who paid for his drinks, treated my other customers with respect, and didn't cause any trouble. Everything else is just details." Zephyr reached into what Jake now realized was some kind of concealed pocket in his scaled hide and produced several small, golden coins. He placed them on the bar with careful precision. "I do not know your currency," Zephyr said. "I hope this will suffice." Jake picked up one of the coins, feeling its weight. It was clearly made of real gold, and the craftsmanship was unlike anything he had ever seen. The surface was covered in intricate designs that seemed to shift and flow in the light. This is way too much, Jake protested. It is not nearly enough, Zephyr replied. Tonight, you gave a stranger shelter, warmth, and acceptance, without asking for anything in return. Such gifts are beyond price. With that, the dragon moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the handle and looked back at Jake and Mrs. Chen. Thank you, he said simply. Both of you. I will not forget this kindness. Then he was gone, disappearing into the night as suddenly as he had arrived. Jake and Mrs. Chen sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing what had just happened. Well, Mrs. Chen said finally, that was interesting. Jake looked down at the golden coin in his hand, then at the empty glass where Zephyr had sat. Something told him this was only the beginning of a much larger story, and that the quiet dragon who had sought shelter from the storm would return. When he did, Jake had the feeling that everything would change not just for him and his little bar, but for the entire relationship between humanity and the stars. 3 weeks passed before Zephyr returned to Murphy's bar, and when he did, he wasn't alone. Jake was restocking the liquor shelves when he heard the familiar chime of the doorbell. He turned to see Zephyr ducking through the entrance. But this time 2 other figures followed him. One was clearly another dragon, though smaller and with scales of deep blue rather than Zephyr's forest green. The other was something Jake had never seen before, humanoid in shape but with skin that seemed to shimmer like oil on water, constantly shifting between different colors. Jake, Zephyr said, inclining his head in greeting. I have returned, as promised. So I see, Jake replied, setting down the bottle he had been holding. And you brought friends. The blue-scaled dragon stepped forward, and Jake immediately noticed the difference in bearing between the 2 creatures. Where Zephyr carried himself with quiet authority, this one radiated barely contained aggression. Golden eyes similar to Zephyr's swept the bar with obvious disdain. This is Admiral Korath, Zephyr said by way of introduction. And this is Ambassador Flux of the Chromatic Collective. The shimmering humanoid creature Flux nodded politely. When it spoke, its voice had an oddly melodious quality, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. We have heard much about this establishment from our colleague. All good things, I hope, Jake said, moving behind the bar. Admiral Korath snorted, a sound that came out as a puff of actual smoke. I did not come here to sample primitive intoxicants. I did not come here to sample primitive intoxicants. Korath. Zephyr's voice carried a warning tone that made the Admiral's head snap around. There was a moment of tension that Jake felt like a physical weight in the air. The 2 dragons stared at each other, and Jake found himself wondering exactly what kind of hierarchy existed between them. Then Korath's shoulders sagged slightly, and he moved to one of the bar stools. Whiskey, the Admiral said curtly. The same as Zephyr described. Jake poured the Irish whiskey, noting how Korath handled the glass with the same careful precision as Zephyr had. Flux declined alcohol but accepted a glass of water, which immediately took on the same shifting, iridescent quality as the creature's skin. So, Jake said, breaking the uncomfortable silence, what brings you all to my little corner of the universe? Zephyr exchanged a glance with Flux before answering. I may have spoken too freely about our previous encounter. Word has spread among certain circles that I have made. Contact with humans. Contact? Jake raised an eyebrow. Is that what we're calling having a drink now? You do not understand, Admiral Korath interjected harshly. What Zephyr did by coming here alone, by speaking with you as an equal, it violates every protocol we have established since arriving in this system. Jake poured himself a beer, taking a moment to process this information. Let me get this straight. Zephyr got in trouble for having a conversation? Not trouble, Flux said diplomatically. Concern. There are those among our respective peoples who believe that informal contact with humans could complicate our mission here. And what mission would that be? Jake asked. The 3 aliens exchanged looks again, and Jake caught something that looked like guilt in Zephyr's expression. We are here to evaluate your species, Zephyr said finally, to determine whether humanity represents a threat to the established order of this galactic region. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Evaluate how? Your military capabilities, your technological advancement, your social structure. Admiral Korath listed off. Standard procedure when a new species achieves interplanetary travel, and if we fail this evaluation, the silence that followed was answer enough. Jake set down his beer with carefully controlled movements, suddenly very aware that he was having this conversation with beings who could potentially decide the fate of his entire species. However, Flux interjected smoothly. Zephyr's report has introduced complications to the standard evaluation process. What kind of complications? Zephyr leaned forward, his golden eyes intense. I told them what I experienced here. The kindness you showed a stranger. The lack of fear or aggression. The simple human decency that you and Mrs. Chen displayed. Such qualities are not typically factored into our assessments. Admiral Korath made a dismissive sound. Sentiment and weakness. Sentiment and weakness. No, Zephyr said firmly, his voice carrying an authority that made even the Admiral pause. Strength of a kind we had not considered. Jake found himself studying Zephyr more carefully, noting the way the other two deferred to him despite their obvious disagreements. You're not just any random alien. Are you? I am what you might term an emperor, Zephyr admitted. My people call me the flame of the eastern stars. Jake blinked, processing the fact that he had served drinks to alien royalty without knowing it. Emperor. Right. Should I be bowing or something? The question seemed to catch Zephyr off guard, and he actually laughed. That is exactly the reaction that confounds our evaluation protocols. How so? In my experience, Zephyr explained, when lesser beings discover they are in the presence of supreme authority, they react with fear, supplication, or attempts at manipulation. You seem genuinely unconcerned with my status. Should I be concerned? Jake asked. I mean, you're still the same guy who paid for his drinks and listened to Mrs. Chen's stories. The title doesn't change that. Admiral Korath slammed his glass down on the bar with enough force to crack the wood. This is exactly what I warned you about. This human shows no proper respect for the natural order. Perhaps, Flux said thoughtfully, that is precisely the point. The ambassador's shifting form had settled into a golden hue similar to Zephyr's eyes. In our initial observations, we noted humanity's remarkable tendency toward cooperation across genetic and cultural lines. Most species we encounter are tribal, organizing themselves into rigid hierarchies based on strength, birthright, or resources. But humans organize themselves around ideas, Zephyr finished. They follow leaders not because they are the strongest or the most genetically superior, but because they inspire belief in something greater than individual survival. Jake thought about this while he cleaned glasses. I suppose that's true. Though we're not exactly peaceful. Wars, conflicts, all that. Yes, Admiral Korath said, seizing on this point. Your species has a documented history of violence and conquest. Your planet is divided into competing factions that regularly engage in armed conflict. True enough, Jake admitted. But we also have a documented history of people risking everything to help strangers, of enemies becoming allies, of individuals standing up to overwhelming power because it was the right thing to do. The bell above the door chimed again, and Mrs. Chen shuffled in from the evening drizzle. She paused when she saw the three aliens at the bar, then shrugged and took her usual seat. Evening. Boys, she said to the aliens, as if addressing old friends. Jake, the usual. And make it strong. My arthritis is acting up. Jake poured her gin and tonic, watching as the three aliens observed Mrs. Chen with fascination. The old woman seemed completely unperturbed by their presence, treating them as she would any other customers. Mrs. Chen, Zephyr said, may I introduce Admiral Korath and Ambassador Flux? Pleased to meet you, she said with a nod. Any friends of Zephyr's are welcome in my book. Admiral Korath stared at the elderly human woman, as if she were a particularly complex puzzle. You show no fear. At my age, what's the point? Mrs. Chen replied, echoing her words from their previous meeting. Besides, if you were planning to hurt anyone, you wouldn't be sitting here making polite conversation. How can you be so certain? Flux asked, genuinely curious. Mrs. Chen took a sip of her drink before answering. Body language. In my line of work, you learn to read people quickly. You three aren't here to cause trouble, you're here because you're trying to figure something out. Jake marveled at the old woman's perceptiveness. Mrs. Chen was a seamstress for 50 years, he explained to the aliens. Worked with all kinds of people from all walks of life. Indeed, Mrs. Chen said. Rich, poor, young, old. From every corner of the world. After a while, you realize that underneath all the surface differences, people are basically the same. They want to be safe, to be valued, to matter to someone. Admiral Korath's expression had shifted from dismissive to thoughtful. Your species fascinates me. You display both remarkable compassion and terrible cruelty. Sometimes within the same individual. That's humanity for you, Jake agreed. We're complicated. Complicated in ways that make our standard evaluation criteria inadequate, Zephyr said. How do you assess the threat level of a species that can simultaneously wage war and create art that moves the soul? That can be petty and vindictive in personal relationships, yet sacrifice everything for the welfare of strangers. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of helicopters overhead, their rotors beating a thunderous rhythm that made the windows rattle. Through the glass, Jake could see searchlights sweeping the street. Admiral Korath's head snapped up, his nostrils flaring. Military forces, they've found us. How? Flux asked, its form shifting rapidly through different colors in what Jake interpreted as agitation. Zephyr's expression was grim. Someone must have reported our presence. We should go. Wait, Jake said, moving to the window. The helicopters were definitely military, but they seemed to be maintaining a perimeter rather than moving in for an attack. They're not acting hostile. More like they're protecting something. The door burst open, and a man in an expensive suit strode in, flanked by two soldiers in full combat gear. Jake recognized the type immediately: government official, probably high-ranking CIA or NSA. Agent Harrison, Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs, the man said, flashing credentials. We need to talk. Lug. Admiral Korath was on his feet instantly, wings partially unfurled in a threatening posture. Flux's form had shifted to a deep red, and even Zephyr looked ready for violence. Easy, Jake said, stepping between the aliens and the government agent. This is my bar, and these are my customers. If you want to talk, you do it respectfully. Agent Harrison's eyebrows rose at this display of protectiveness. Mr. Murphy, you're harboring alien dignitaries who could potentially reshape the future of human civilization. This is a matter of national security. They're having drinks, Jake said flatly. Mrs. Chen, are you feeling threatened by our alien friends here? Not at all, the elderly woman said calmly. They've been perfect gentlemen. Agent Harrison looked around the bar at Jake, standing protectively in front of the aliens, at Mrs. Chen sipping her gin and tonic as if this were the most normal thing in the world, at the three powerful beings who had chosen this humble establishment as neutral ground. This is not how these situations usually develop, the agent said. More to himself than to anyone else. How do they usually develop? Zephyr asked. Fear, panic, demands for protection or negotiation from positions of weakness, Harrison admitted. What we have here is unprecedented. Flux finished, which is exactly what we've been trying to explain to our respective peoples. Unprecedented. Unprecedented peoples. Agent Harrison holstered his weapon and gestured for his soldiers to stand down. Perhaps we should all sit down and discuss this like civilized beings. Jake couldn't help but grin. Now you're talking. What can I get you to drink, Agent Harrison? As the government agent settled onto a bar stool between an alien emperor and an elderly seamstress, Jake realized that this bizarre gathering might actually represent something historic. Not first contact in the traditional sense, but perhaps something more important: first understanding. The helicopters continued their patrol overhead, but inside Murphy's bar, 5 very different beings sat together and tried to figure out how to navigate a future none of them had expected. The meeting that would determine the fate of humanity began not in a gleaming government conference room or a sterile diplomatic facility, but in the back room of Murphy's bar, around a scarred wooden table that had seen decades of neighborhood poker games and birthday celebrations. Agent Harrison had made a series of increasingly frantic phone calls, explaining to his superiors why he was conducting first-contact negotiations in a Queen's dive bar. Jake had simply moved bottles and glasses to clear space, treating the historically significant gathering like any other private party rental. "The situation is unprecedented," Harrison was saying into his encrypted communicator. "Yes, sir. I understand the protocols. But these beings specifically requested to continue meeting here." "No, sir. I don't think moving to a secure facility would be productive." Zephyr watched this exchange with what Jake had learned to recognize as amusement. "Your human bureaucracy struggles to adapt to unexpected circumstances. You have no idea," Jake said, pouring fresh drinks for everyone. "Want to see them really panic? Tell them you want to hold the negotiations over Sunday brunch." Admiral Korath, who had gradually warmed to the humans over the past 2 hours, actually chuckled at this. "I begin to understand why you found this place so compelling, Zephyr." "The question," Flux interjected, its form shifting to a calmer blue, "is whether this small sample truly represents your species as a whole." Mrs. Chen looked up from her knitting. She had produced yarn and needles from her seemingly bottomless purse and was working on what appeared to be a scarf. "Of course it doesn't, dear. No small group can represent 3 billion people. But it's a start." Harrison finished his call and rejoined the group at the table. "My superiors are concerned about the informal nature of these proceedings." "As are mine," Admiral Korath admitted. "The Dragon Council expects a full military assessment of human capabilities, not philosophical discussions over alcoholic beverages. And the Collective Council wants detailed economic and resource evaluations," Flux added. "They're particularly interested in your planet's rare earth deposits." Jake felt a chill at these words. "What happens if we fail your evaluations?" The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Finally, Zephyr spoke. "Standard protocol calls for either subjugation or quarantine. Species deemed too aggressive are contained within their home system until they develop beyond their violent tendencies. Those with valuable resources but inferior technology are absorbed into the galactic community as client states." "Client states," Jake repeated. "That's a fancy way of saying slaves. The reality is often more complex than that," Flux said diplomatically. "But not always," Zephyr said quietly. Agent Harrison leaned forward. "And what determines which category we fall into?" Admiral Korath's golden eyes fixed on the government agent. "Normally, the evaluation is straightforward. We assess military strength, technological advancement, resource availability, and social cohesion. Species are then classified as either threat, resource, or irrelevant." "Cheerful," Mrs. Chen muttered without looking up from her knitting. "However," Zephyr continued, "our observations here have identified characteristics that don't fit into standard categories. Your species displays something we have rarely encountered in our expansion across the galaxy." "Which is?" Harrison asked. "Adaptive empathy," Flux said. "The ability to extend compassion and cooperation to entities fundamentally different from yourselves. Most species we encounter can barely manage peace among their own kind, let alone with aliens." Jake thought about this while refilling glasses. "Is that really so unusual?" "Extraordinarily so," Zephyr confirmed. "My own people, for example, organize themselves into rigid hierarchies based on individual power. Cooperation exists only when it serves personal advancement. The concept of helping someone who can offer nothing in return is foreign," Admiral Korath finished. "As is the idea of challenging authority not for personal gain, but because of principle. Yet that is exactly what Jake did when he stepped between us and Agent Harrison," Flux observed. "No logical reason for such behavior. We could have killed him easily." "But you wouldn't have," Mrs. Chen said, finally looking up from her knitting. "Because you're not monsters, just people from far away trying to figure out how to live with new neighbors." The simplicity of her statement seemed to strike all 3 aliens simultaneously. Zephyr stared at the elderly woman as if she had just solved a complex mathematical equation. "New neighbors," he repeated slowly. not threats to be neutralized or resources to be exploited. Neighbors. That's all anyone wants, really, Mrs. Chen said, returning to her knitting. To know that the people next door aren't going to hurt you, and maybe to borrow a cup of sugar now and then. Agent Harrison looked confused. Cup of sugar? Metaphor, Jake explained. Mutual aid. Helping each other out when needed. This is precisely what I have been trying to explain to the council, Zephyr said, excitement creeping into his voice. Humanity possesses something we have forgotten in our pursuit of galactic dominance. You have maintained the ability to see others as individuals, rather than merely as extensions of their species' collective characteristics. Well, Jake said, mostly. We've got our share of bigots and xenophobes, but they're not in charge, Harrison pointed out. The decision to meet with you here, in a civilian location, was made at the highest levels of government. We could have tried to capture you, or refused contact entirely. Instead, you sent me to talk, Harrison continued. Someone whose job is to communicate, not to fight. Admiral Korath's expression had grown thoughtful. In our culture, first contact is always conducted by military commanders. The assumption is that any new species represents a potential threat. While we send economists and resource specialists, Flux added, our primary concern is always how a new species can benefit the collective. We sent a bartender and a seamstress, Jake said with a grin. The absurdity of it hit all of them at once. Here they were, representatives of 3 different galactic civilizations, conducting possibly the most important diplomatic meeting in human history, and the humans had fielded a guy who served drinks for a living and an elderly woman who fixed clothes. Your people sent us their heart, Zephyr said quietly. Not their sword or their ledger, but their heart. The weight of that observation settled over the table like a blanket. Agent Harrison was furiously taking notes, undoubtedly trying to figure out how to explain this to his superiors. The 3 aliens sat in contemplative silence, while Mrs. Chen continued knitting as if the future of human civilization wasn't being decided around her kitchen table. So, Jake said finally, what happens now? Zephyr straightened, and for the first time since entering the bar 3 weeks ago, Jake saw him fully embrace his role as an emperor. The casual demeanor fell away, replaced by the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected entire worlds. Now I make a choice that will likely end my reign, Zephyr said calmly. What do you mean? Harrison asked. The Dragon Council expects me to return with a recommendation for either conquest or quarantine. Admiral Korath's military assessment will carry significant weight, as will Ambassador Flux's economic evaluation. But the final decision rests with me. Admiral Korath leaned forward. Zephyr, you cannot seriously be considering. I am considering something unprecedented. Zephyr cut him off. I am going to recommend that humanity be offered full membership in the galactic community as equals. The statement hit like a thunderbolt. Flux's form shifted rapidly through a spectrum of colors that Jake was beginning to recognize as intense emotion. Admiral Korath looked as if he'd been physically struck. That is not possible, the Admiral said. Humans have barely achieved interplanetary travel. They have no established colonies beyond their home system. Their technology is primitive compared to ours. Their technology is different, Zephyr corrected. They've focused on different areas of development, and their social achievements far exceed their technological ones. The Council will never accept it, Flux warned. Full membership requires unanimous approval from all existing members. The precedent alone would cause chaos. Then perhaps it's time for some chaos, Zephyr said. The current system has brought us conquest and expansion, but at the cost of everything that makes life worth living. We have become efficient at survival and terrible at living. He turned to Jake. In my culture, the highest virtue is individual strength, the ability to stand alone against all challenges. But in 3 weeks of observing your species, I have seen a different kind of strength. The strength to stand with others, even when it costs you personally. That's not strength, Mrs. Chen said, still knitting. That's just being human. Exactly, Zephyr said. And perhaps it's time the galaxy learned what that means. Agent Harrison was scribbling notes frantically. What kind of opposition can we expect from the other galactic powers? Even what of Hearts? Significant, Admiral Korath said grimly. There are species that will view Zephyr's recommendation as weakness. They will argue that humans should be subjugated before they become a threat. Number. Let them come, Mrs. Chen said mildly, holding up her knitting to check a stitch. We've dealt with bullies before. The casual confidence in her voice made all three aliens stare. Here was a 75-year-old woman, barely 5 feet tall, expressing complete unconcern about potential conflict with star-spanning civilizations. You would fight? Flux asked. If we had to, Mrs. Chen replied. But mostly we'd try to convince you that we're worth having around. Same as we always have. Jake found himself nodding. That's really all we can do, isn't it? Be ourselves and hope it's enough. Zephyr stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding from the chair. I believe it will be more than enough. But the path ahead will not be easy for any of us. He turned to Admiral Korath and Ambassador Flux. I need both of you to stand with me in this. Your species' support will be crucial. Admiral Korath was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his empty glass. You ask me to argue that a species barely capable of leaving their homeworld should be granted the same status as civilizations that have existed for millennia. I ask you to look beyond their current capabilities to their potential, Zephyr said. In 3 weeks, they have shown us more genuine friendship than we have experienced in centuries of galactic politics. The military implications are staggering, Korath continued. If humans are granted full membership, they'll have access to our technology, our weapons, our strategic knowledge, and we'll have access to theirs, Jake pointed out. Seems like a fair trade. Flux's form had settled into a warm amber color. The collective will be concerned about economic disruption. Introducing a new species with different values could destabilize existing trade relationships. Or it could open new markets and opportunities, Harrison suggested. Humanity has always been good at finding innovative solutions to complex problems. Innovation born from necessity and creativity rather than pure technological advancement, Zephyr mused. Yes, I can see how that would be valuable. Admiral Korath suddenly stood and moved to the window, staring out at the street where government vehicles maintained their perimeter. I have spent my entire career believing that strength comes from the ability to dominate others. But watching Jake stand between us and armed soldiers to protect his customers, that required a different kind of courage. He turned back to the group. I will support your recommendation, Zephyr. Though I reserve the right to say, I told you so if this all goes horribly wrong. Flux rippled through several colors before settling on a deep blue. The collective values stability above all else. But perhaps some instability is necessary for growth. I will also support the recommendation. Agent Harrison looked up from his notes. What do you need from us to make this work? Continue being yourselves, Zephyr said simply. The galaxy is about to meet humanity for the first time. Show them what I have seen here, your capacity for growth, for compassion, for finding strength in unity rather than division. Mrs. Chen finally set down her knitting and stood, revealing that she had been making a scarf in rich greens and blues that perfectly matched Zephyr's scales. Here, she said, offering it to the Dragon Emperor. For the long journey home, Zephyr accepted the gift with obvious emotion, the careful stitches tiny in his massive hands. Thank you. I will treasure this. Just remember where it came from, Mrs. Chen said. Remember that sometimes the most important things come from the humblest places. As the three aliens prepared to leave, Jake realized that everything was about to change. The quiet neighborhood bar that had been his whole world was now the center of a galactic revolution. Humanity was about to take its place among the stars, not through conquest or technological superiority, but through the simple act of being decent to strangers. Will we see you again? Jake asked as Zephyr reached the door. The Dragon Emperor turned back with a smile that Jake could now read clearly. Oh yes, after all, I'll need somewhere to celebrate when the Galaxy Council approves our recommendation. And if they don't? Zephyr's expression grew serious. Then I'll need somewhere to drink to what might have been. The door closed behind them, leaving Jake and Mrs. Chen alone in the bar. Outside, the government vehicles were pulling away. Their mission apparently complete. The helicopters had already disappeared into the night sky. "Well," Mrs. Chen said, settling back into her chair and picking up her knitting. "That was interesting." Jake poured himself a whiskey, the good stuff, and raised his glass in a toast. "To new neighbors. To new neighbors," Mrs. Chen agreed, clinking her gin and tonic against his glass. Outside, 3 ships launched silently into the night sky, carrying the fate of humanity to the stars. In Murphy's bar, a bartender and a seamstress sat quietly together, having just changed the course of galactic history over drinks and conversation. It was, Jake reflected, exactly the kind of thing humans would do.